Tonight, 4 years after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a quiet gathering took place in Northampton. It was not loud. It was not political. It was not filled with speeches or banners. It was a commemorative service. And it happened inside the Holy Sepulchre Church. 4 years. That is the marker. 4 years since the invasion began. 4 years since lives changed direction. 4 years since distance became something measured not in miles, but in absence. The Holy Sepulchre Church in Northampton opened its doors to the Ukrainian community. They came together. They came to pray. They came to stand in one place at one time to acknowledge what that 4-year mark means. The setting itself mattered. Stone walls, still air, a place built for reflection. And on this day, reflection was exactly what filled the room. This was not a political rally. It was not a demonstration. It was a service. A moment carved out of ordinary life, a pause. Organizing the event was Solomia Blagitko. She arrived in the United Kingdom from Kiev in May 2022. That date is important, May 2022, not at the beginning of the invasion, but after it had already reshaped daily life. She came here, and she is still here. Speaking about the moment, she said it was unbelievable that she remained in the UK and that the conflict was still ongoing. Unbelievable. That word carries weight. It does not describe politics. It does not describe strategy. It describes the passage of time, the kind of time that feels suspended, the kind that stretches. 4 years ago, an invasion began. Today in Northampton, people gathered to mark that fact. Solomia organized Monday's event, Monday, a weekday, an ordinary place in the calendar. And yet, for those inside that church, it was not ordinary at all. She arrived from Kiev. She did not say she expected to stay this long. She did not outline plans. She simply described the feeling of still being here and the conflict still continuing. There is something striking in that pairing. Still here, still ongoing. Time has moved forward. Circumstances have not resolved. That is the reality acknowledged inside that church. Another member of the community was there, Tetiana Hornick. She is a teacher. She settled in Rushden with her 2 sons in December 2022. December 2022, again, not at the beginning, but months into the conflict. She arrived with her children, 2 sons. She had hoped to go home after a few months. That was the expectation. A temporary chapter, a short stay. But as she said, unfortunately, I can't. Those words are simple. They are direct. They do not contain analysis. They do not carry accusation. They simply describe a condition, an inability to return home. The service at Holy Sepulchre Church brought together people like Solomia and Tetiana, people who arrived on different dates, from different cities under different circumstances, but connected by a shared beginning point 4 years ago and connected by the present, a present that continues. The church became a gathering point, a place where prayer stood in for words that might be too heavy to say out loud, a place where silence did some of the speaking. There were no grand declarations described, no announcements, just a commemorative service, a recognition of time past and time still unfolding. 4 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That sentence alone sets the frame. It tells you why people gathered. It tells you why Monday mattered. It tells you why the doors of Holy Sepulchre Church opened for this community. For Solomia, arriving in May 2022 marked a turning point. For Tetiana, arriving in December 2022 marked another. Different months, same conflict, same ongoing reality. Both women spoke in plain language. Unbelievable. Unfortunately, I can't. Short sentences, human sentences. They do not attempt to explain the scale of events. They do not measure geopolitics. They measure lived experience. They measure waiting. Inside that church, the Ukrainian community came together to pray. That is the central action. Prayer, not protest, not policy, prayer. And sometimes in moments like this, prayer is less about asking and more about remembering. Remembering where you were 4 years ago. Remembering the first phone calls. Remembering the decision to leave. Remembering the hope that it might be temporary. Solomia said it was unbelievable that she was still here and the conflict was ongoing. There is a rhythm to that sentence. Still here, still ongoing. Time and place intertwined. Tetiana said she had hoped to return after a few months, but she cannot. Hope met with duration. Expectation met with reality. The commemorative service marked 4 years since the invasion. It did not attempt to resolve those 4 years. It simply acknowledged them. And sometimes acknowledgement is its own form of strength. Standing together in Northampton, in a church built centuries ago, marking 4 years of something that began far from those walls. The distance between Kiev and Northampton is geographical, but the connection remains immediate. And in that church on that Monday, the Ukrainian community chose to gather, to pray, to mark the date, to say in presence rather than in slogans that 4 years have passed and that they are still here. One sentence spoken softly seemed to capture the moment. We are still here. It is not political. It is not analytical. It is simply true. 4 years later in Northampton, that truth filled the room, and that is where this begins. Inside the Holy Sepulchre Church, time felt different. Outside, Monday moved along as usual. Traffic passed, phones vibrated, appointments happened, but inside, the pace changed. It slowed, it softened, it narrowed down to a single purpose: to remember, to pray, to mark 4 years. The Ukrainian community gathered not as spectators, not as observers, but as participants in something deeply personal. This was not an abstract anniversary. It was 4 years of lived experience, 4 years of decisions made quickly, 4 years of uncertainty, 4 years of adapting to places that were never meant to be permanent. When Solomia Blagitko stood there, she stood as someone who had arrived in May 2022. She did not arrive in the first days. She arrived after the situation had already become long-term. After it had become clear that returning quickly was uncertain, and still, standing there years later, she described it as unbelievable. That word matters because unbelievable does not mean confusing. It means difficult to accept, difficult to absorb, difficult to reconcile with what you once imagined. She organized Monday's event. That means she did more than attend. She coordinated, she reached out, she gathered people, she created the space for this moment. That act alone tells its own story. It says this matters enough to bring everyone together. It says this is worth pausing for. It says 4 years deserves recognition. The church became a kind of temporary home, not in the sense of residence, but in the sense of belonging. For an hour, for a service, for a shared moment, it became a place where people did not have to explain themselves. They did not have to translate their feelings. They did not have to summarize their past. Everyone in that room understood why they were there. Tetiana Hornik was among them, a teacher, a mother, a woman who arrived in Rushden with her 2 sons in December 2022. She came with an expectation, just a few months. That was the plan, that was the hope, that was the quiet promise made to herself and to her children. We will go back soon. This is temporary. This is just for now. But now became longer. Weeks became months. Months became years. And now, 4 years after the invasion began, she says she cannot go home. Unfortunately, I can't. That sentence carries no decoration, no elaboration, no drama, just reality. In that simplicity, it becomes heavier because it reflects acceptance, not resignation, not defeat, acceptance of what is. Inside the church, stories like hers did not need to be spoken aloud. They were present in posture, in silence, in the way people sat, in the way hands folded, in the way eyes lowered. Prayer filled the space, not as performance, not as spectacle, as necessity. For some, prayer was about memory. For others, it was about endurance. For others, it was about holding on to connection. Connection to people, connection to places, connection to a version of life that still feels close and yet far. 4 years is long enough for routines to form, for new addresses to become familiar, for new streets to feel navigable, for new schools to become normal. And yet, it is also short enough that the past still feels recent, still vivid, still emotionally near. That tension lived in the room, between settling and waiting, between adapting and remembering, between building and longing. Salomia's comment about it being unbelievable that she was still here reflected that tension. She did not say she was unhappy. She did not say she was content. She said she was surprised by duration, surprised by continuity, surprised that what once felt temporary had stretched this far. That is what 4 years can do. It reshapes expectations. It redefines normal. It turns emergency into routine, and routine into something quietly heavy. The service did not attempt to resolve that. It did not try to offer answers. It did not promise timelines. It did not predict outcomes. It simply created space. Space to acknowledge that this is where things stand right now in Northampton, in Rushden, in homes across the region. People who came in 2022 are still here. People who thought they would leave are still here. People who hoped for quick returns are still waiting, and they gathered together not to complain, not to debate, to pray, to remember, to mark time. There is something deeply human about marking time. Birthdays, anniversaries, memorials. They all exist because people need structure for memory. They need moments to stop and say, this mattered, this happened, this changed us. 4 years since the invasion is one of those moments. And in this church, that marking was quiet, respectful, focused. No slogans, no banners, no chants, just presence. Tetiana's story is especially striking because of its simplicity. A teacher, a mother, 2 sons, a plan for a few months, a reality of years. There is no embellishment, no dramatic framing, just a life redirected. Her words, "Unfortunately, I can't," hold both disappointment and clarity. They acknowledge loss without dramatizing it. They accept circumstance without pretending it is easy. That balance was present throughout the service. People were not pretending everything was fine. They were not performing despair. They were simply there, in truth, in honesty, in shared understanding. At one point, a voice in the room softly said, "We're still waiting." It was not a complaint. It was not a demand. It was a statement. A quiet summary of 4 years, still waiting, waiting to return, waiting to reunite, waiting for stability, waiting for closure. The church itself seemed to absorb that. Old stone, high ceilings, spaces designed for centuries of human emotion, grief, hope, fear, faith. This service joined that long tradition, another chapter in a building that has seen countless chapters. The Ukrainian community did not come to be seen. They came to be together. They came to remember. They came to hold space for each other. For Solomia, organizing the event meant carrying responsibility, responsibility to honor the date, responsibility to create dignity, responsibility to bring people together. For Tetiana, attending meant stepping into a collective moment, one that mirrored her own story, one that reminded her she was not alone in this experience. 4 years after the invasion, 2 women, 2 timelines, 1 shared reality. Arrivals in May 2022 and December 2022. Still here in 2026, still gathering, still praying, still acknowledging time. The service did not end anything. It did not close chapters. It did not resolve uncertainty, but it did something equally important. It recognized continuity. It recognized endurance. It recognized that life continues even when circumstances remain unresolved. And sometimes that recognition is essential, because without it, time just passes, unmarked, unacknowledged, unprocessed. On this Monday, time was marked carefully, quietly, respectfully. And in that marking, the community affirmed something simple and profound. They are here, they remember. They continue, and they do so together. As the service at Holy Sepulchre Church came to its close, nothing dramatic happened. There was no sudden shift, no clear ending, no sense that something had been resolved. Instead, there was a gradual return to ordinary movement. People stood, coats were adjusted, hands were folded and unfolded, soft voices exchanged brief words, and slowly the moment loosened its grip. But it did not disappear. It lingered. It followed people as they stepped back into the outside world. 4 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That was the reason for gathering. That was the frame for everything that happened inside those walls. And when people left the church, that frame did not vanish. It stayed with them in their thoughts, in their routines, in their plans, in their waiting. For Solomia Blagitko, the end of the service did not mean the end of responsibility. She had organized the event. She had brought people together. She had created space for this moment. And now, like everyone else, she returned to life as it is now. Life in the UK, life far from Kyiv, life shaped by a decision made in May 2022. Her words remained in the air, that it was unbelievable she was still here, that the conflict was still ongoing. Those 2 facts placed side by side tell the story of duration, not in statistics, not in headlines, in lived time, in years measured by adaptation, by learning new systems, by navigating new communities, by building something that was never meant to be permanent and yet has become home, at least for now. For Tetiana Hornik, leaving the church meant returning to Rushden, returning to her life with her 2 sons, returning to routines that began in December 2022, routines that were supposed to last a few months, routines that became years. Her words, Unfortunately, did not echo loudly. They did not demand attention, but they carried weight. They reflected the reality of many in that room, people who hoped, people who planned, people who expected to go back and who are still here, still waiting, still adjusting. The service did not attempt to answer the question of when. It did not speculate. It did not predict. It did not promise. It simply acknowledged where things stand. Right now, 4 years later, in Northampton, in Rushden, in homes scattered across the region, people who arrived in different months, under different circumstances, with different expectations, now share a similar reality. They live in between past and future, between memory and possibility, between what was and what might be. The Holy Sepulchre Church provided a setting for that in-between space. A place where uncertainty could be held without explanation, where grief and endurance could exist side by side, where people did not have to justify their feelings. They simply had to show up, and they did. They came to pray. They came to remember. They came to mark time. And time, in this context, is not just calendar time. It is emotional time. It is psychological time. It is the time it takes to accept that temporary has become extended, that waiting has become a way of life, that plans have been suspended without clear endpoints. For many in the room, 4 years represents a shift from emergency to endurance, from crisis to continuity, not because things are resolved, but because people have learned how to live within unresolved circumstances. That is not surrender. It is survival, it is adaptation, it is resilience expressed quietly, not in slogans, not in speeches, in daily routines, in school drop-offs, in work schedules, in community gatherings, in services like this one. Solomia's role as organizer reflects that shift. She is not just someone who arrived and waited. She is someone who acted, someone who created community, someone who turned a date on a calendar into a shared moment. That is significant. It shows that life has not been put entirely on hold. It has been reshaped, redirected, rebuilt, even as longing remains. Tetiana's story reflects another dimension, the dimension of parenting and uncertainty, of raising children in a place that was not meant to be permanent, of explaining to them why a few months became years, of maintaining stability while carrying unresolved questions. Her presence at the service was not symbolic. It was practical. It was real. It was a reflection of her lived experience and the lived experience of many parents in that room. Throughout the service, what stood out most was restraint. No one exaggerated, no one dramatized, no one claimed certainty. People spoke plainly, they shared simply, they allowed silence to do much of the work. That restraint gives the moment credibility. It keeps it grounded, it keeps it honest. There was no attempt to turn personal stories into slogans, no attempt to turn grief into spectacle. Instead, there was dignity, quiet dignity, earned over 4 years of navigating complexity. One voice, near the end, offered a simple sentence that seemed to settle over the room. We're still here. Not as a declaration, not as defiance, as fact, still here, still present, still gathering, still remembering, still hoping, even when hope looks different than it once did. That sentence did not need elaboration. It did not need context. Everyone understood it, because it described them. 4 years ago, many lives were redirected. Paths changed, plans dissolved, geography shifted, and yet, here they were, in Northampton, in a church, together, marking time. The service did not offer closure, but it offered continuity. It reminded people that they are part of something larger than individual waiting, that their experiences connect, that their stories intersect, that they are not navigating this alone. That matters, especially over long periods, especially when uncertainty stretches on. Communities like this one do something essential. They turn isolated waiting into shared endurance. They transform private uncertainty into collective understanding. They create spaces where people do not have to carry everything by themselves. This service was one of those spaces. It did not pretend to solve anything. It simply acknowledged reality. And sometimes acknowledgement is powerful. It validates experience. It says, what you are feeling makes sense. What you have lived through matters. What you are still living through deserves recognition. As people left the church, the world outside did not change. Traffic still moved, shops still opened, phones still buzzed, work still waited, life continued, but something had been marked. 4 years had been acknowledged, memory had been honored, presence had been affirmed. Solomia returned to her life in the UK, still here, Tetiana returned to her home in Rushden, still unable to go back, still caring for her sons, still navigating uncertainty. And they did so with the knowledge that they are part of a community that gathers, that prays, that remembers, that endures. 4 years since the invasion, marked not with spectacle, not with slogans, but with quiet strength, with restraint, with dignity, with shared humanity. And in that quiet church in Northampton, on an ordinary Monday, something important happened. Time was acknowledged, lives were honored, waiting was witnessed, and people reminded each other simply by being there that they are not alone. We're still here. Sometimes that is the whole story.